Hi, I'm Gabriella of the Merriweather Knitting Podcast and merriweatherliving.com, and today I want to share with you my process for modifying colorwork charts. I recently knit up the rug sweater pattern by the designer Junko Okamoto. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous chunky yarn, chunky weight colorwork sweater. It's a stunning design and I really love knitting it up, but I knit it up with a big modification. That modification was many modifications that I completely kind of redid and reworked all of the colorwork charts. I ended up kind of creating a motif of my own and I really loved the process of that. In general, I think it's a lot of fun to create colorwork charts, and I think knowing how to do it and how you can modify existing charts is a really cool and wonderful tool to have in your knitting arsenal for whenever you maybe want to adjust a colorwork chart, whether that be if there's a sweater pattern you've knit often, or some mittens, or any pattern that you've knit often. Maybe you love the fit, you love the wear, the style of it, but you want some variety when it comes to the motif and the design and the pictures that appear in the knitting. Then you can modify them yourself, if you just kind of want to get creative, but you don't want to have to completely construct a pattern from start, design it from start. You can, from the beginning, you can kind of just modify colorwork charts. That's one way you can do that too, and it can be a lot of fun and a great kind of fun creative expression. But there are some things you have to be aware of and think about in that process, and so I thought I'd share this with you. It's a very intuitive, very simple process once you kind of get the hang of it. It's really, really easy, but I thought I'd share with you all the same and kind of just walk you through how I do it. I'm going to show you 3 different ways that I do that practically, like with materials, and I'll share with you then kind of things you have to keep in mind and the basic how-to of it also along the way. The first and simplest way to modify colorwork charts is using graph paper, which is my favorite way, the way that I most often do modify and create colorwork charts. Of course, everything I share in this video also applies for creating your own charts. All you need is just some graph paper with little squares, and if you don't have graph paper, any paper will do if you just create a graph on it. That's all it takes, paper with little squares, and that's your colorwork chart. Colorwork charts are made up of many squares on a graph, and each single square represents one stitch. And so that's the most important thing you need to keep in mind through the whole process. As you start to fill in the squares, as you start to kind of let your creative imagination run wild and you kind of start to draw and sketch, you have to think about the stitches and how they fit. But the first way I like to do it is on graph paper, and that's my most often used method. A pencil and graph paper with an eraser. If you're making color work with more than 2 colors, then colored pencils are wonderful. You can use colored pencils to fill in the different squares and also get a really good visual and kind of really be able to see what it might look like in the end. A big part of designing colorwork charts is the imagination that you have to have, and you have to kind of be able to visualize how it will look in the finished knitted piece. Because of course little X's or little marks on a chart look different than beautiful knitted yarn. But color pencils can help. So if you have a hard time imagining it and visualizing in your mind, using colored pencils, even with just 2 colors, can help a lot. The other 2 ways in which you can kind of create little blank canvas charts for your modifications are either on the computer or on a phone. And those are the 2 ways that I know. I'm sure there are other ways, but I like to, in the past, I've made many, many charts, and when I design patterns, I create my charts just simply using the Numbers app on Mac computers. I'm sure that there's the same thing on Windows. It's been a long time since I've used Windows, but just any kind of basic chart numbers maker. I use it, a simple chart to create, like a simple graph to create my chart. And then when I'm using my phone, which is a very new discovery for me, I actually just discovered this option recently after I've never made a chart for my personal use this way, but I think I'm going to in the future because it just seems super easy and fun, and also something that you could kind of just do kind of on the fly if you have your phone with you, is to create charts using a chart making app or a graph paper app. And there are, I'm sure, a huge plethora, huge, unending number of chart making apps or graph paper apps to be found in the app stores, whether that be the Android app store or the Apple app store, whatever that may be. I have an old Samsung phone, and I'll tell you the app that I use. I use a new app I just discovered, and I think it's pretty fine. It's called Stitch Art. I'll put the logo here so you can see. And Stitch Art is a really cool app because you really can easily create charts that are meant for knitting. Yeah, so it's a new find for me, but I really like it. I will show you now how I do it. So I actually wanted to share my charts, the charts that I had made for my modified rug on my website, which will be linked below in case you're interested in that pattern. And so I use this app to make those charts, but I have not made charts to knit myself for myself, but it just seems wonderful. So they also have cable options here to create cable charts and lace charts, which is very cool, but we're focusing here on Colorwork. So you see, this is how it looks when you open it up. These are some of the charts I've made, and then these are some of their default charts. So let's look at this chart. They have this little Scotty chart. It's easy to knit from because you have this kind of scrolling thing. They also have color palettes you can choose from for different colors, which makes it very easy. But I'm just going to show you how I created a chart very simply. So I clicked on Create New Empty Chart, and it just shows up with this chart here. Now I'm going to pretend that I'm modifying a very simple Colorwork chart that is, let's just say, 10 by 10 squares. Now this is the most important part, and now we're entering into the very practical side of chart modification and chart making. What I'm going to show you here on this app applies to all methods of chart making, whether you're doing that on the computer, on a graph, program with graph paper, and you're typing it in or you're filling it in, maybe in an Illustrator kind of a way. It applies in that context, and it of course applies the same way when you're doing it manually with pencil and paper on some graph paper. It's all the same concept. Now I'm just going to show you this way. The most important things you need to know at the very beginning of creating your chart are the width and the height of your graph. So we're going to go for, let's say we're going to go for 17. We're going to go for 7 stitches wide, and let's say 10 stitches tall. Now, I don't know what this is, so this is just an imaginary situation. Let's say that the pattern we're working from has a chart with dimensions, and so that's what you always need to look for first. Look at the pattern you're wanting to modify, look at the chart you're wanting to modify. The simplest way to do it is to just modify with that exact dimensions that the pattern offers. Getting into more advanced kind of modifications of charts, you could change that up as well. There are other ways you could do that. To keep it simple when you're first modifying, modify exactly with the chart stitch amount. So let's say it's 7 by 10. We're going to keep ourselves in that limit, and it's going to be wonderful. So we're going to also delete the grid. Always right to left, not always, but of course most of the time it's right to left unless you're working in the flat. Most Colorwork charts are just in the round, so it's always right to left. Knit the chart one time. Let's see. Okay, now I like to put the grid down so that there's no grid. I just bring it all the way to the top, so that there's no extra grid, so you can just have a very clean visual of your chart. So here we have it. This is the chart. And we're going to now fill in the blanks. So these are the dimensions that our pattern gave us, our theoretical pattern, and we're just going to fill it in. Maybe the original pattern was like something like this. Oh no, I'm sorry, it's mirroring, but it works. Let's just say that this is the original pattern. This is how it looked at the start. And we don't like how it looks, or we want something else. Then what we're going to do is just take these dimensions and fill it in our own way. Now, we've got to make sure this here up at the top is a reflection thing. So now there's no reflection. Okay, so what do I want to make? Now, personally, I'm a very big fan of botanical kind of prints, so I'm going to make something botanical and very lovely and floral, perhaps. And so I'm going to think about how I'm going to do that. Maybe I'll start with the stem. It's a nice odd number here, so I can just kind of go up. Let's start with the stem. And maybe I go this high with the stem. And I add some leaves to the stem, let's say, I don't know, maybe like that, who knows, you know, I'm kind of doing this in real time, so I'm not so sure, who knows how this will look, but, oh, I don't like how that looks because it touches, so you've got to start to think about how it's going to look in the end, and as you modify, that's a really important thing to just take note of and think about, because here if I do this, it's going to look like a little square where these touch. So you want to make sure that you keep paying as much attention to the negative space as you do to the filled in main, you know, contrast color space, because they will interact in ways that you don't expect sometimes, and that can be something that I think I ran into trouble with when I first started to kind of create or modify my colorwork charts, because I think, oh, that's a cool idea, let me do that, and it ended up touching. So I actually like to keep a good amount of negative space, because then you can really see the motif. That is, of course, you know, not a strict rule, because sometimes you want things to touch and you want to have kind of a continual pattern, and, you know, maybe we can do that in a second, but this is how my little design looks. So now I'm making a little flower. Let's say this is the flower design. It's kind of a sort of flower looking thing, you know, so this is kind of my design. This is the modification. I filled it in, it's as simple as that, and this is my little flower that's growing. Now, it kind of looks cut off a little because the top line there, it kind of feels like it's missing right above the top, and I feel like it's missing a square. Maybe I could modify that by just lowering the whole thing by one, you know, and bringing it down and then placing this bottom stitch at the top, at the top here, and then keeping it down. You have to play around with these things, so let me do that actually. Okay, so, you know, that experimentation brought me here to this spot where I will, you know, now have a more cohesive design. It looks very cute, I like it, and there will be nice negative space, 2 stitches between each flower. And so there'll be negative space. If I want less negative space, I could make this a wider design, perhaps like this. Then it would touch all the way around. All the leaves would be touching because there's no negative space between. Or I could just experiment with different concepts, think about it, you know, think about how I'd want to make it work. There are endless ways that you could do this. Now, if you want to make it all touch, if you want to have a continual design, then, like I said, you'd have no negative space. And let's say we want to do that. We want to create something like that. You can do it, and if you want symmetry, you can use the reflected feature on here, or you can just kind of experiment on your own to see what you'd like to do. There is really no limit for what you can do. And so it's really that simple. It's really so intuitive and so easy. But at the beginning, it can be hard to even think about how does that even work. It's just important to remember that each single square represents 1 stitch, and the graph needs to stay the same in dimensions. To get into the more advanced level, let's say, of modification, you could pay attention to total stitch count and multiples that would, you know, fit into that stitch count. So let's say that you have 100 stitches on the needles, and you have a motif which is 5 by 5 stitches, and there's no increases in this motif. It's just a simple motif, 5 by 5, and it's 100 stitches. Now, that 100 stitches, you could make it 5 stitches high and 100 stitches different. You can make a completely crazy, cool, wild motif that's 100 stitches long, theoretically, or 50, or 25, or 10. If you think, oh, the 5 stitches wide is just too constricting for me, you could make it 10 stitches, or you could make it 15. Wait, is 15 a multiple of 100? Just as long as it is a multiple of the total stitch count, you can pretty much have any width you'd like for the stitches. And keeping the height the same, of course, until and unless, getting even more advanced, there isn't much shaping in the design. You can compensate the height too, and then fill it in completely. And of course, these modifications end up making a design completely different than the original design, especially when you get into those crazy kind of real wild modifications where you just, everything is different. But it's maybe your first step into designing, and I think that modifying patterns is part of the fun. I've heard designers talk about this. I remember hearing a designer, I think it might have been Andrea Mowry, I'm not sure, but talking about, someone asking the question, how do you feel about knitters modifying your pattern? And I don't know if it was her, but I think she said something like, designers, we love to see our designs come to life as the knitters kind of take it into their own hands and apply their own creativity. And I am, I have designed a couple of patterns myself, but I can tell you from my experience, it's so exciting to see my concept, my design really take on a life of its own based on what a knitter personally does with it, whether that be the yarn choice, the colorway choice, or the modifications they choose to make. I think it honors the design too in a lot of ways to make modifications, because it's not just about like the designer having their work out there. It's also about the knitter and the maker taking part in that process, taking part in creating a garment that they will wear, that they will treasure. And I think it's just really a fun thing to be able to apply that creativity. And, the designer's done the work of figuring out gauge, figuring out all the real technical elements that compose a design, construction, techniques, all those different kinds of things. And so sometimes as a knitter, you just want to knit a piece for yourself that has like a little something special. And if it's colorwork pattern, modifying the charts is a wonderful way to do that while maintaining the beautiful, gauge and all that structural, technical kind of work that's put in by the designer, that the designer offers you in their finished pattern that you purchase. So yeah, it's just another way to be creative in your knitting and another way to maybe push your limits and step outside of your comfort zone and learn something new and express your creativity. And so I really enjoy modifying colorwork charts sometimes, not always, but sometimes it's just fun. And I hope that you enjoy it too if you give it a try. I hope this video is helpful. If it was, let me know. I'd love to hear about it. But yeah, I had a couple of people had mentioned and asked how I do that exactly, how I do modify charts, how that was done. And so I thought I'd share, and I hope that you take it with you and maybe try it too yourself. Thank you so much for watching. It was so lovely to have you, and I'll see you again next time for more videos on knitting and making. Take care. Goodbye.